This is Father Gregory Pine.
And this is Father Bonaventure Chapman.
And welcome to Godsplaining. Thanks to all those who support us. If you enjoy the show, please consider making a monthly donation on Patreon. Be sure to like and subscribe to Godsplaining wherever you listen to the podcast. It is funny because there are a variety of nouns, and most of those nouns cover the same nominative territory.
Yes.
It's like Godsplaining podcast show. You have to do them in the right cadence, otherwise you get yourself
Showing the podcast to others.
Yeah, show the podcast to others by subscribing to something else. Right, so for this episode, we're delighted to be joined by John Bishop.
It's
John,
good to
welcome.
be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, Dr. John Bishop, a recent graduate of the Catholic University of America.
There you go.
So something that you and Father Bonaventure share.
Okay, I did not know, but yeah.
Also 2 eyes.
Yep, good to be a cardinal.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, academic pedigree.
Yeah.
And I got to know you through Focus Summer Projects,
That's right.
a formation program that Focus runs, as you might imagine, over the summer with projects, so as to form students kind of in that build stage in the faith through a variety of cool outdoor and indoor resources. But yeah, for those who don't know you, those who haven't been on Focus Summer Projects with you, could you just say a word of introduction, who you are, where you're from, what you do?
Yeah, so from Des Moines, Iowa. I'm married. I have 3 kids, and it's...
Do you really?
I do. Isn't
That's
that crazy?
wild.
Since the last time I saw you.
Okay,
Yeah.
I think I knew you had 1, but 3 is 2 more. That's awesome.
Yeah,
Okay.
we have a 4.5-year-old, a 2.5-year-old, and a
half-year-old,
and a 11-month-old.
Okay.
Yeah. So
rounds down to half for parallel structure.
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah, exactly what I was thinking. So. Yeah, so I graduated from Catholic U. I did spend the last 8.5 years prior to about the last year, so up until January 1st of 2024, I worked for Focus in a variety of capacities. One of the things that I did was to kind of help summer projects get off the ground, go to other places around the country. It was fun getting to know you in the very early days of summer projects. We were in Colorado for several summers, climbing mountains and teaching kids about theology and everything in between.
Exactly.
So, but yeah, I run an apostolate now called Forge. Forge is fundamentally an organization that fights for the family, but we do so with a strategic emphasis on men. So we take inspiration from groups like Focus on the Family and also Focus, the Fellowship of Catholic University Students. But the way that we go out, so I say that
And you named it FORG.
I was gonna say, did you just change a few letters,
Wait
right?
a second.
It's
Are they all
got to be
capitals?
5 letters. It's got to start with an F. And so, Forge is a blend of 2 foci, and going after the family with an emphasis on men.
Synthesis.
With an emphasis, not a focus, an emphasis.
on men.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's right. Forge has been going now for about 14, 15 months. We did our first public event in November of 2023. And here we are recording now in February of 25. It's been an adventure. We're growing very, very quickly. We do work fundamentally, most especially in Des Moines, Iowa, where I'm from. But we have people all over the country who are picking up our curriculum now, and it's gotten a degree of traction to the extent where just a few months back, we were recognized by an organization called Cent Ventures to be a top 5 emerging Catholic nonprofit in the United States. So gotten some traction. We work with men, seeking to reverse the negative trends of men in the faith and the negative trends with respect to fatherhood, both in the church and outside the church. So that's Forge. We're fighting for the family with a strategic emphasis, not focus, on men. Thanks again for having me on today.
No, that's great. I'm thinking, so usually what comes before why, I suppose. But so you talked a little about what Forge is for,
Right.
the men. But how, or I should say, what are the pieces of it? That's what I meant, the what for it. So we've got it sounds like there's a curriculum. Is this a classroom kind of thing, or is this a study kind of thing, or is it multifaceted? What does it consist?
Yeah, good question. So when you think of Forge, I think it's best truly from 30,000 feet to say that Forge is fundamentally a movement. We do make curriculum.
Okay.
We make content of a variety of different kinds, including podcasts, full-blown courses, so on and so forth. But all of the tools that we make, the content that we make, are geared towards an interpersonal setting, if you will. So what we do in Des Moines during these first 2 years, which we're kind of viewing as our incubation years, what we're doing really is just founding a million small groups. We do host a lot of large events, retreats, conferences, things like that. But the purpose of all of those large events is to feed the small events. So right now we coordinate about 52, 53 small groups of men in Des Moines. So those are groups of, on average, 7 or 8 men. Average age would be guys in their probably like late 30s, early 40s, who are they're in the thick of things. That is, they're married, they have children in the home, and they're seeking to be better dads. So the curriculum that we make, usually what a piece of curriculum will look like is it'll have a video explaining some aspect of fatherhood, or coaching guys to be better fathers, or alerting fathers to a particular kind of threat to their families, and then helping them tackle it. So there'll be a video that they can watch together, a discussion guide, a written guide. And I'm hopelessly biased, but they're exceptional resources.
But it's because you were a perfect man, and so you just kind of like recorded yourself for a couple years, and then those are the videos are just like spliced out daily experience of your life with your kids.
That's right. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So I can. I mean, really, I did it in about an afternoon, and the whole organization came from that.
It's actually just a workout program.
Yeah.
Flexing with Bishop.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay. So the first time that I was introduced to, specifically your passion for men's formation was at Summer Projects, and it was, you were drawing on some of the research that you had done for your dissertation.
That's right.
And I remember you having, 2 books, and the one book in particular written by Walter Ong, some of the insights that you drew from that really resonated. But I think folks, they kind of hear the things on the internet, and they have some vague kind of notion that maybe complementary gender roles have been somewhat undermined by 3 waves of feminism and by the current confusion with gender dysphoria or gender ideology. And so they might be looking for purchase, but they're worried about a kind of characterization of masculinity which might fall afoul of the contemporary culture's allergy to toxic masculinity.
Right. Yeah.
So it's what have you found in your research, and what are you able to present in your curricula, but also in, these small events that you host, which can help people to discover and grow in a genuine masculinity?
Yeah. So really happy to be on specifically on this podcast, because I feel like I can kind of speak in a greater degree of detail about first the crisis of masculinity, which was laden in that the preamble to your question, and then what I take to be the solution of it. So I'm going to describe it here really briefly.
You don't have to be brief. You can take 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Buckle up, listeners. I hope you have a seatbelt on, whatever you might not be. Never mind. Keep going. Here we go.
Yeah. The solution, which is I think most especially what you're asking for, is that I think there needs to be a positive image of masculinity, especially for young and adolescent boys, but even for millennials who are getting older, baby boomers, to go after. The world has done a great job of deconstructing masculinity in several different spheres, whether it's in academia, in popular culture, or just in ordinary relationships that you would have in your parish. But the world, and I would say this is one nuance that I think I can add to the conversations on masculinity that is helpful to articulate here, especially in a podcast of this nature, that when the world threw masculinity out, they kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater, but there was some bathwater. I think a lot of people, especially in devout Catholic circles, sort of think, if only we could go back to 1950s masculinity, that would just solve all of our problems. But I think my take on this is that there are facets of what might be referred to as traditional masculinity that were kind of thrown out for good reason. And I can speak about a few of those facets here in a moment. But my call to Catholics would be that, yes, we need to reclaim a new version of masculinity, and the kind of raising of the foundations, the cultural foundations of the masculine picture is indeed a crisis, but it's a crisis that presents a beautiful opportunity, as is the case with any crisis that the church encounters. This blank slate that we have now is hopefully an opportunity for us to kind of, sketch a picture of masculinity anew, that shines forth more beautifully. So what we need to do as a culture is to re-embrace not necessarily a carbon copy or an exact copy of masculinity as it was 70 years ago, but masculinity as it flows directly from the anthropology revealed by our faith, by science, so on and so forth.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the before you asked the question about the kind of the solution, I think it's maybe worthwhile to just rest for a minute on what I call the crisis of masculinity, what that is, what the sources of that problem might be, and then I think we could more clearly see what a solution looks like. So if it's all right with you, I think I might jump in.
I'm here for it. Yeah,
okay. Yeah. So you asked Father Pine. What do people call you these days? So you Father Pine, Father Gregory?
Typically Father Gregory, yeah.
Father Gregory,
Yep.
yeah. So is there a real crisis of men and masculinity? Or is that just, some... I remember thinking as a graduate student, you're suspicious of, are these just, maybe... Is it maybe something that is present in my social media echo chamber or in the particular news outlets that I read? Or is there actual evidence to support the fact that men are in trouble, both in the world at large and in the church? And the resounding answer to that question is that there is truly a problem. And that problem is recognized increasingly actually on both sides of the political aisle. It's recognized in and outside the church. I saw just a few weeks ago that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation gave Richard Reeves a very large sum of money to found an institute, for the healthy cultivation of boys and men. Mm-hmm. I remember in the process of my graduate studies, talking to a guy that headed up the American Psychological Association's Society for Men and Masculinities, and he was just deeply concerned about this problem. Mm-hmm. And when I say the problem of men and masculinity, from a non-religious perspective, usually what you're talking about is things like decreasing rates of male education, success in education. Yeah. So obviously universities are approaching a 2-to-1 female-to-male ratio across the entire country. Yeah. So over 60% of university students are female these days. If you look at job success, interest of particularly men in their 20s in entering the workplace, period, is declining. Male incarceration rates are skyrocketing. The success the interest rather that men have in marriage is plummeting. And so society-wide, there's certainly downward trends in really every relevant sociological statistic when it comes to men and masculinity. And we haven't even started talking about the church yet, right? And this, those are all statistics, but I think it's worthwhile here to kind of maybe make those statistics a reality if they're not already for the listeners. When I first got interested in this problem, it wasn't so much that I'd seen a lot of statistics, but more that I'd just seen a lot of sad people. So I like you said, I worked for a long time at Focus, which for people who don't know it, it's a collegiate organization, Catholic organization that reaches out to college students. And I just saw hordes of women and almost no men. And as a single guy at the time, it was a wonderful thing, right? But now as I get older and I see so many of my friends who are women in Catholic circles climbing the ladder of their 20s, their 30s, their 40s with no good men to marry, that crisis really kind of comes home. And if there are men to marry, it's often, men who aren't interested in getting a job, men who are struggling in their life at large. Maybe they're struggling with various different sexual addictions. Maybe they just lack interest and drive, whatever it might be. They also lack an interest in their faith. That it's really tragic, just to see so many people who are heartbroken and whose lives have been negatively impacted by what you'd call the crisis of masculinity. Yeah. All the statistics that I say there certainly apply to the church as well. So 2019 Pew Research says that 61% of your average U.S. Catholic congregation on any given Sunday is female, and it's only 39% male.
Oh, it's that high? Okay.
Yeah. Horrible stat. And it's a horrible stat not just for this generation. It's an even worse stat when you kind of factor into that whole picture at this point sociological fact that perhaps the best predictor of faith in the next generation is what the fathers of this generation look like. So there's at this point a mountain of sociological evidence to show that if you're going to hone in on any specific factor that could predict whether or not a child is going to someday grow up to be a faithful Catholic adult, look at their father. So you've got a church that's been drained of men, and men standing as the primary religious predictor of their children. Those two factors together are deeply problematic. So when I talk about the crisis of men and masculinity in the church and in the culture, those are some of the things I'm talking about. It's
and John, so the statistics are there, and
sure,
people can see them. And this, but of course, if the causes of those statistics or those things are institutional or cultural or geological or what have you, or scientific or
Dude,
whatever.
shale.
Yeah, if it turns
Watch
out
out for shale.
tectonic plates just mean we're not going to go to college as much.
Yeah.
So
Probably Wi-Fi.
Yeah. Do you
Yeah,
have
roll it
do you have any sense of? And then the causal analysis is so tricky. But what do you get the sense of the like big causes, the pillars that are holding up this kind of crisis masculinity? Like it could have been like just a number of small things that add up, or there are a couple in your research like, no, these are actually the real roots of this crisis, and therefore the things we need to deal with directly to change. Do you get a sense of, and this could be in the secular, just the anthropological sense, or in the religious sense as well, any sense of like, yeah, you can tell this is the smoking gun, here's one of them, two of them, three of them, that kind of thing? Or do you think it's just we're not, because sometimes in crises it's hard to tell, you just know something's wrong and we don't know exactly what the cause of it is. Are we at that stage, or is it a mix of the two, or what do you think?
Yeah, well, Father, I think you're right in saying that the cause of the crisis of masculinity is probably multifaceted. So I think you can look at things in the church, that about the liturgy, for example, and I think there are interesting conversations to have about that. I think there's interesting things in the world of education, that pertain to a sort of lack of sensitivity to, particularly for very young boys, masculine learning styles. Right? There's things in the media that the whole like toxic masculinity movement that are there.
Tonic masculinity is what we should go for, and I kind of like that.
I like that
phrase,
too.
Tonic masculinity. I forget where I've heard that, but I like it. We're not toxic. We're tonic masculine.
You mean like the base note of a scale, or like the water that has quinine?
Both.
Oh, okay.
Like it's helpful and also reassuring.
You know who I
maybe?
heard say that for the first time? Bill Donahue over at the Theology of the Body Institute. I think it might be the source of that term.
Okay.
I think that might be true.
That's right.
Yeah.
I know with Bill the other day. Yeah.
Yeah, but I want to actually zero in on what I take to be a kind of like seminal negative toxin, if you will, that influenced all of masculinity. I think the root of it all is contraception. I'm really deeply convicted of that.
Yeah.
And I became deeply convicted of that first, actually reading a non-Catholic author. So though the Catholic Church, I think, has a unique contribution to make here insofar as we are more or less the sole major religious denomination that is held to the classic teaching on contraception. I was reading an author who had a rather unfortunate name. So he's an evolutionary sociologist out of Rutgers University named Lionel Tiger. So Dr. Tiger, not making that up. It's actually his name.
There are worse names.
Yeah.
He's crushing it.
Yeah. It's certainly memorable. Yeah. But so I was reading this guy, and he was talking about, he's sort of coming at the problem of the decline of men in a book that was literally called The Decline of Males. And he was kind of going through what might be the cause of the crisis of men and masculinity. And he says, you know what? I kind of want to like approach this problem in the same way that Karl Marx would approach this problem. And for lack of a better way to put it, he's like, I think men are kind of like the disenfranchised masses, that they've lost their stake in not the process of production, but rather the process of reproduction.
Yeah. Yep.
And a very sort of like core thing that society has always and everywhere had an interest in upholding, that is the bond between fathers and their children, has been weakened by the contemporary sexual revolution, and especially by contraception. And so he sketched the process like this. He says, look, all societies in all places, well, that's too strong. Many societies in many places have been very focused on cultivating strong father-child bonds, right? For all of the 1,000,001 reasons that a strong father-child bond benefits children. But our society has kind of like produced an atmosphere that weakens that bond by taking even more of what he calls the sexually predictive power and placed it in the hands of the female. So it's always been the case that when a woman gets pregnant, the biological mother has a more ready vested interest in the child, right? It's literally in her womb. She is the child's sole source of sustenance when the child first comes into the world. So that the father can more easily leave, right?
Sure.
And that's certainly the case in our days. It used to be the case in the early 1960s that about 9% of the American child population didn't have a resident father. That stat has now gone up to 25%. So one in 4 American kids does not have a resident father. By the time kids reach their 17th birthday, less than half of them have a resident father.
Yeah.
So men leave in droves, or they never form the bond in the first place. And Lionel Tiger says that really kind of what happens here is in the same way that an individual who works at McDonald's kind of has no ownership in the company at large and doesn't really feel any affinity, to the process of production that they're a part of, in the big corporation that they work for. In the same way, when even more of the kind of the ability to predict whether or not you're going to have a child, whether or not a particular sexual act is going to be open to life, and then, of course, the child custody laws, the abortion laws that proceed from contraception, place more and more power in the hands of the woman and disenfranchise the man more and more and more. Men do the same thing that a worker at McDonald's does. And they say, well, I don't really care about McDonald's. I'm kind of just here to get the things that are readily utilitarian, valuable for me.
I just want money.
Right.
It used to be pleasure. Yep.
Yeah. So I think at the beating heart, the kind of the wellspring of the alienated male is the sexual revolution at large. But the thing that brought about that sexual revolution as a kind of core toxin is contraception. I don't think there's anything that hurts men more. Even though it might be subtle, it's like an invisible poison that is causing the crisis.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It seems to me that this focus on the family, the first of the foci, that whether you take the family unit, so the husband and wife, this is the kind of household code that goes back to the Greeks, and of course Paul picks up in Ephesians, like that husband and wife are male and female are like a unit.
Right.
And anytime you start to separate out into say individuals, like an atomized sense, then you're going to have other reasons to stay together. When you talk about the bond here, not just between the child and the father, but really the fundamental bond between the man and the woman that then allows for that other bond to be formed because they're together. And it's right to say that contraception strikes against that bond because it now becomes a possibility that I can see myself as we can make decisions about our union and about what will produce of that and what kind of union it will be, whether it'll be a life-giving union, potentially, or whether we're going to exclude that and it's going to be another kind of union.
That's
Whereas
right.
traditionally, so contraception allows the man and the woman in the relationship to now treat each other as partners in some kind of utilitarian base or something like
transactional.
And it's not that it's not that people who are using contraception necessarily understand this kind of stuff. I take it's a symbolic and it's also a structural principle. But when you start to make decisions about what's going to outcome from this, whether we're actually be united in a child potentially from this, then you see yourself not as together as a unit, but rather as two people doing something together.
Yeah.
But not being together in the most literal sense. And that is, people say, well, what's the pill or the contraception thing? But it's none of that's symptomatic of that breakage of, I take it, the male and female union as one, which has to be the central of any sort of society and make any sense. The Pope's been saying this for a while, but but it just seems true. It bears it out. You're right, and that breaking that bond, I think, leads to so much of this.
Right.
Right now we're off because women are doing great and men are just floundering.
Right.
I've got to follow up on that later, but keep going.
Yeah, and for men, precisely the thing that called most of them to greatness, which was their marriages and their families, is now sort of an optional add-on. Right. So the thing that enticed them to get married, which was a woman, is disconnected from the thing that oftentimes truly called them to greatness, which was their children. And of course, that downward spiral just continues, and here we are today with all the statistics that I mentioned to you earlier. So while I don't think contraception is kind of the only influence, I think it's if there's any specific thing that you could target to have a kind of multiplier effect and positively influence the culture, I would say, bring back the whole scale vision for the church's vision on sexuality, including what was kind of like the original deviation, big time, well, not the original, but the wholesale deviation of the church from that vision. And that was at the invention of the pill.
Yeah, it's a lot of you could say you get your most bang for the buck.
Right.
To get doing that one. Yeah, I think that's JP2 had this kind of vision, this sense, and repackaged and re-understood it in this sort of the love and responsibility and the theology of the body. He was going for this. He was trying to do this. And then we got I don't know. It'd be interesting to the history of how the re-embracing of this vision, the nuptial vision, you could say, is. Are we heading up another? Are we on the way to something higher in this? Doing this again?
Yeah.
Like because it was a big in the 90s, and what JP2 was talking about in theology of the body, all this stuff, and then it seemed like it kind of whether it just petered out or something. We focused on maybe we got too political, but now it's like, oh yeah, well, if you're going to be the political stuff can't be unless you have the family stuff. So it might be coming back to this. Do you think, or do you think we were always just ascending in it? Or do you feel like we gave up from it and now you're saying like, hey guys, seriously though, let's get back to it in a new way?
Yeah, so let me kind of split that question into two, and let's talk about the sort of state of the American, or at least I'd say of the Western church when it comes to contraception and the church's vision for sexuality. Yeah. And then the theology of the body question, okay, which I think are two very interesting questions to spend some time with. So when we talk about the sort of wholesale embrace of the church's vision for sexuality, I think that amongst the active Catholics in the United States, the number of people who are on board with that is skyrocketing. I think there's a genuine organic growth where if you are the kind of individual who attends Mass on Sunday and you are below 50 years old, the likelihood of you not using contraception in your marriage, that sector is quadruple what it was, say, for your active maybe baby boomer Catholics.
And can you give me, like, if it's quadruple of 1, then it's 4. Like,
right.
what do you have any sense of this statistic? Do you have any sense of this statistic?
No, this
it's hard to get this one, of course, be accurate about it. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I've searched for the statistic of what percentage of, for example, American Catholics are obedient to the church's teaching on contraception. Yeah. And to my knowledge, I've never found that stat. So that what I'm talking about here is sort of the anecdotal
sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I do think it's the case that the number of what you would just call active Catholics, okay, is declining in general, right? Yeah. And that just sort of bears out in the statistic. Yeah. But of those active Catholics, the percentage of individuals who are kind of like right down the line Orthodox, including on the issue of contraception, is on the rise. Yeah. Church is smaller, but sort of like more devout, more Orthodox, right? Yeah. I think a lot of people would readily recognize that.
I think that's right.
Now, when the theology of the body thing is interesting, it's I first encountered theology of the body in 2002 probably as a 6th grader. I remember picking up Christopher West's good old Theology of the Body for Beginners.
Fascinating.
Reading that and being very, very excited about the whole thing. And to this day, I'm a huge proponent of theology of the body. I think it's a wonderful thing. What's interesting to me about theology of the body is that in my anecdotal experience, the same statistics of individuals who are interested in the church at large and the kind of general, scarcity of men certainly plays out in the theology of the body camp. Where it's like you go to kind of sort of like a theology of the body retreat or people who are interested in theology of the body. And you oftentimes find mountains of women, but less men. Sure. That's an interesting problem because I think theology of the body has been kind of the best tool that the church has used to bring people back to complete orthodoxy on sexuality. It's the best thing that we've had.
But if it's used as a replacement for it,
right?
Like what it can be is like, oh no, the other thing was the church's teaching tradition. It was not, but theology, but a gift to us. So instead of as a means to the church's full teaching, in a sense, it can be seen as like the alternative or replacement, or like this is the new thing,
or the only option on offer. I think more. commonly.
No, that's exactly right.
It's just like, what does the church think about sex? Theology of the body. And there is nothing else.
No, that's right.
There's no Thomas. There's no anything.
No history of the entire.
Right. Just we articulated our vision for sexuality between 1979 and 1984 in a series of Wednesday audiences.
Perfect circumstances.
Nothing existed prior to that time. Right. So that's oftentimes the case.
That's right.
And as a lover of theology of the body, it's still consoling for me to know that there are a lot of other beautiful kind of treatments of the topic that are on offer out there. Nevertheless, I worry about the theology of the body thing if it doesn't also include kind of like a healthy masculine angle. And perhaps more than other theologies, it's really in grave danger of not possessing that healthy masculine angle. Because what is theology of the body? Well, you might think of theology of the body as an application of the spousal analogy, right, to the topic of sexuality. The spousal analogy being, basically the position that the love of God is like the love of a good spouse. Obviously, as Thomas would say, it is so much better than that. But some little glimmer that we can get into the nature of God's love is that God's love, analogically, is like the love
bridegroom
of a bride and a bridegroom. Okay, who's the bride and who's the bridegroom? Well, humanity, the church, is obviously the bride, and the Lord is the bridegroom. And I think then when you talk about theology of the body, it can consciously or subconsciously be repulsive to men, because they're like, I'm not a bride, I understand that I'm supposed to have a kind of receptivity, but this doesn't speak to me as a man in the same way that it might as a woman. So I think there's something at the core of theology of the body that can make it susceptible to even more effeminacy than is present in the church at large.
Yeah,
I was actually so concerned with this topic that I wrote a dissertation on it.
It is. Perfect.
Then
until that dissertation, you had to grab Jose Maria Escriva or something the way and just inject hardcore masculinity into it. If you did those two together, you're okay.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. No, yeah. So I
think that's right about the bridal imagery and the bride and the church as having this feminine. We always talk about this. The church as a sort of feminine nature because receptive. Mary, of course, Vatican II. Mary is the key model of the church in a way. So of course, But within that, there's still also the male and female dynamic within the church, and then the men. Well, where do they fit in that? That's right.
Yeah,
that's good.
Yeah, and so whereas somebody, speaking very practically, like let's just say that you have, like a seminarian who's been in formation for a long time. I used to teach at the Catholic Seminary in Denver, and given a certain maturity of the interior life, I think you can explain things like the spousal analogy in a way that really amplifies one's understanding of God and is good and wholesome and healthy and helpful, right? But the audience that theology of the body is most commonly given to, specifically like, a group of middle and or high school boys and girls sitting on a gym floor and trying to deal with their hormones, that group might not be like especially the boys in that group. It doesn't get the same purchase.
No, quick chippy door.
Yeah. And so that's where it certainly is. I know a lot of deeply masculine men who are in love with theology of the body. I personally love theology of the body, which is not to say that I'm a deeply masculine man, but that I am aspiring to be one. But
you got those tapes. You're good.
That's right. Yeah. But I think there's room for development there, and the development is in the same way that theology of the body and the corpus of John Paul II at large certainly has a deep reverence for the feminine. There's room for development when it comes to use kind of some cheesy terms here, a masculine genius, right?
Well, no, this is fascinating, and Father Gregory's going to jump in at some point here, but it's because I could just keep talking. But it's fascinating to me that John Paul II didn't write encyclical
very much
dedicated.
Yeah, not encyclical. No,
he did. Now some people say, "Oh, well, it's the Joseph encyclical about the
apostolic exhortation."
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah,
but he doesn't. The masculine genius just is. It's taken for, in a way, it's taken for granted, and such as you write. So it is the lacunae.
That's true.
Lacuna, I should say.
Kind of to be as charitable as we can to obviously the extraordinary Pope who was Pope St. John Paul II. Who was he speaking to at the time? Like, what was he trying to address? And I got to think that what was in the center of John Paul II's ministerial sights was something like third wave feminism, right? And the cashing out of third wave feminism into the ranks of the church, right? Yeah. So that's very heavily on his mind, which is why he writes the letter to women, why he writes Mulieris Signitatem, so on and so forth.
Yep.
He does speak, on the virtues of Saint Joseph, but there's not anywhere near the development in his thought on the masculine than there is on the feminine, and that's not,
which is okay.
It's just like you don't have to write on
and the
everything.
Tradition had developed. You could say the tradition has developed some of this already. And it was being thrown away, and he just didn't think that it was as you say. we need to develop the feminine one correctly because the thing on offer opposed to it is totally incorrect. There's nothing on offer opposed to the masculine one, whereas that is the circumstance today.
That's right.
There's a
sort of like frontal assault, on masculinity in the same way.
Not the same for him that time,
Right. Yeah. In the 70s and 80s, it was more women's liberation and the various confusions that are going on in the wake of that cultural moment. And even though the seeds of the crisis of masculinity were certainly like in the soil,
sure,
they're not as apparent.
Yeah, that's right.
Right, as the issues with women were at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, quick question. I'm thinking specifically about the point you made earlier, apropos of Lionel Tiger, and whether or not Marxism is the best way by which to approach this. This isn't whatever, you got it. I'm thinking too, like, it seems like feminism has won, or it seems like feminism has achieved many of its putative goals, at least as conceived by those who pertain to the movement.
That's right.
But it seems like it's won within a broad-based Marxist understanding as to the disposition of nature, because it's like, if all you have here on the surface of the earth is just push and pull, or just up and down, then when women win, men lose.
That's right.
So it strikes me that like part of the understand, and it's like it seems like
zero-sum game.
Yeah, it seems like St. John Paul II is trying to advocate for something after the manner of complementarity, precisely as a way by which to lift up both men and women. He's more preoccupied with lifting up women insofar as traditionally that's been a bigger task, or perhaps a more urgent task.
Right.
But it seems like we're in a position where we can lift up men, or where we ought to lift up men, but the temptation is just to find ourselves in the same Marxist evolution of push, pull, up, down.
That's right.
And then women will lose. And so I'm thinking too, like the way that you see a lot of these chats moderated on the internet, it's just crass. It's just like, it's real ugly.
Including the chats moderated on the internet in the church.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so there's
and they tend to various reductions of all positions, including what masculinity ought to be. So it seems like there has to be some way by which to at least broaden the mental or broaden the spiritual horizons of those who partake in these conversations, to admit like there's such a thing as transcendence, not just like an abstract or vague transcendence. That's right.
But there is a way by which to get beyond the limited material conditions of your present state and see a higher like union after the manner of, like what St. Paul describes in Ephesians 5 or something like that. That it just seems like we are all born materialists, or at least in the United States, we're all like born materialists.
Right.
And we have great difficulty with anything after the manner of transcendence. So like where do you go?
Yeah. So John Paul II has a great line. This is Familiaris Consortio, that it's only in the duality of the masculine and the feminine that the human finds its fullest realization. And that line, I think, presents a bit of a guiding star as to this entire conversation on masculinity and femininity, that contrary to the Marxist push-pull position that you mentioned, Father Gregory, we must adhere to a version of masculinity and a version of femininity that is synergetic. That is, whatever your version of masculinity is, and whatever your picture of femininity that you paint, that picture has got to be the kind of picture that is helpful to the opposite sex. And if it isn't, then I think you can just kind of squarely say, at least from a Catholic position, that the position must be false, right? So if you, for example, adhere to a position when it, with respect to masculinity, that says, hey, men are just supposed to dominate their feminine counterparts in a way that probably will negatively affect women. But if the only way for men to flourish is that, and if you don't explicitly say that, if your theology, if your anthropology implies that, I don't think that's a Catholic position, right? You just sort of have to reject it out of hand. Now, what is the higher, kind of anthropology to which we can subscribe? Well, obviously that higher anthropology, is one that's theologically informed. So when I was writing on masculinity, I said, gosh, well, if there's any kind of proposition of the church that I want my theology of masculinity to live up to, it's that same proposition that guided the whole of John Paul II's pontificate, that man only finds himself in a sincere and complete gift of self. And that's particularly true of our sexuality, and thereby of masculinity and femininity. That what does masculine flourishing look like? Which is another way to say, like, what does authentic masculinity look like? Well, whatever it is, it must be the kind of thing that results in and finds fulfillment in a gift of self, right? In a way that is synergetic to women. And if you've got something like that, then you've got a picture of masculinity that is at least probably, has it meets muster for being true, right? So that's those I think are the kind of like the starting things that you have to have in place, when you're setting the table and doing theology on masculinity and femininity. Another thing that you have to have in place is I think a anthropology informed by sound science, by the church's teaching, that prescinds, kind of goes above the particular cultural waves of your time. Okay, so there's, I think, a lot of people, particularly those who don't come from any theological tradition, kind of throw their hands up when it comes to what masculinity is and what femininity is, because there is a real sense when obviously these things look different across time and place. So a man in Spain in 1572 expressed his masculinity in a very different way than a millennial or baby boomer American expresses his masculinity in this time and in this place. Okay, and people say, well, they're so different, so you've got to just throw it all out the bathwater. It's all kind of culturally influenced bunk.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so what is that thing? And when I was delving into masculinity in a more robust way, this is where I found Walter Ong. For those who don't know Walter Ong,
background.
Walter Ong is a Jesuit priest and kind of polymath. Wrote a lot on literature, but also did a lot of sociology. St. Louis University had a lot of prominence in the 80s and 90s. And one of the actually little known books that Walter Ong wrote was a book actually on, it was called Contest in Sexuality, and it was a book more or less on masculinity. And in this book, Walter Ong basically examines what evolution has to say when it comes to kind of the bare bones nature of men and of women. And that was really cool to me, because it's like, okay, well, gosh, like masculinity looks different, on the Spaniard, in the 16th century than it does on the baby boomer in 2025 in the United States. But what's common across these two things? What might be the cross-cultural foundation on which we build masculinity? And I think evolutionary biology is about as sort of rudimentary, as you can get, right? And so he's at the heart of his treatment on masculinity pertaining to evolutionary biology. Walter Ong focuses on a few qualities of masculinity that I think are just brilliant and have enormous value for the conversations about the feminine genius and about the masculine genius. The quality that I think is kind of the core quality upon which like the whole rest of the book is built is something called masculine expendability. Okay, think of herd dynamics, in our evolutionary predecessors. When you, of course, we're not talking, about full-blown humans here that have been imbued with, a will and an intellect and, are existing in the image and likeness of God. But if you think of the organisms that conditioned humanity in our evolutionary predecessors, you didn't need as many men, or as many males rather, to achieve the same degree of reproductive fruit, if you will, than women. That is, without being too crass, you can have the same male reproduce with 50 females, right? But the reverse isn't true. You can have a single female reproduce with 50 males. Yeah. So for that reason, at the kind of the split, right, of the sexual binary of our evolutionary ancestors, you have a half of the population that, at least as it pertains to reproductive fitness, is much more expendable than the other half of the population. And that right there results in so many fascinating male psychological traits, right? So it's like, we know that we can achieve the same, thinking with the mind, of natural selection, we know we can achieve the same degree of reproductive fitness if, let's just say, 90% of the males die And in fact, it might even speed the process along. So we're then going to select for those males who have a greater disposition towards risk, for example. And that quality in the masculine psyche, which is a greater aptitude for taking risks, is certainly at play in the present day, right? I mean, if you don't believe me, look at a 16-year-old's insurance rates. You know, that there's certainly a difference between the kind of the appetite that your average man has for risk. And so then when you circling all the way back to a theology of males, a theology of masculinity, authentic masculinity probably looks something like a man who risks, but risks well. Say a man, for example, who's perfected his practical reason, you know? And that man who not in a kind of a miserly or a wimpish fashion or anything like that, but a man who really sees the right risk, takes that risk and takes it courageously, is kind of universally recognized by somebody to be a masculine man. And I think that flows right out of his kind of evolutionary pedigree, if you will. And it's that kind of man that culture at large has a very real interest in cultivating, right? So if there's any kind of cross-cultural quality that we might look at to be part of the cocktail, you know, one of the things that we throw in to produce a good, wholesome theology of masculinity, I think evolutionary biology is as good a candidate as any.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I haven't done Evo Psych in a while, but E.O. Wilson, until Charles Murray, I guess, recently was the only. E.O. Wilson, of course, a great sociobiologist. Worked mostly with ants, but plenty of other stuff too. Human Nature book. He was, of course, one of the until Charles Murray, the only intellectual wild that had been like assaulted on stage by some feminist or something, because he's just studying, evolutionary psychology and group dynamics and all this kind of stuff, and it's just kind of panning out to be a kind of a standard troglodyte-ish fashion about men are in this way. But even from the philosophical, the kind of root Greek conception of things, I mean, what's the virtue, the key virtue arete, of that Aristotle always goes to? It's going to be a male virtue, right? And it's always courage. It's this kind of classic account. Right. This is the one, it's the first one in Nicomachean Ethics he goes to. It's the one he always goes to. That's right. When I'm going to give you an example of why it's the virtuous mean, how you balance prudence. There's something about the so virtue, in its clearest sense, at least outwardly, in its masculine form, ends up being courage, which is this sacrifice in daring, suppressing, right? A book coming out on this, I suppose. Look out, listeners and viewers. Father Gregory will put out a book on courage coming out. So he will correct all this.
But that's exciting.
It's coming. But it's important. Courage, it is the kind of masculine, virtue. I wonder if temperance is think about it. The feminine virtue. Okay. But that this sacrifice, giving, and I like the risking and the giving and the action and all of the kind of masculine terms like active stuff for another.
That's right.
Right? So it's not right. Because
so
I think
it's still ordered towards a gift of self.
Well, that's what I like it, because I was going to say, and Father Gregory brought up that there's a zero-sum competitive game. People, if women might think, and we present this kind of masculine stuff, I'm sure they're just hearing that, like, you guys just, you just want the top again. You just want to be back on the top of the chain. You just don't feel like you can compete anymore. So we're going to go, you guys want us to be subjugated again. And all this domination language sounds threatening to us. But when you bring in, it's not domination for domination's sake. It's not active for active sake. It's not this for this sake. It's for the gift of, I'm acting for giving.
That's right.
Right? That kind of thing. So we just want to talk maybe a little about that, and like, what does that look like? Put some rubber on those.
Yeah.
Those,
so
I wheels.
think one of the things that is sort of lost that it does look like is chivalry. It's interesting. I think there's the traditional male is so readily critiqued by broader culture, but also so potently longed for. That it's still seen to be a very attractive thing when, in a non-chauvinistic, domineering way, like, men hold open doors for women. Once in a while. How dare they? Every once in a while, you do get that reaction, but more often than not, still, I think it's admired. And I think it looks like the kind of dad who is willing to not just put food on the table, although that's certainly part of it, but also the dad who's willing to lay down his life and kind of initiate for the good of his family on the home front, actively participating in the life of the family, initiating like ideas for what you're going to do on the weekend, and dads who are deeply engaged, with that domain of the human experience. A lot of times when people talk about there's a scholar out of Steubenville University named Deborah Savage who has a lot of wonderful things to say about masculinity. One addition that I would make to her wonderful thought is she talks a lot about part of good, wholesome, healthy masculinity is a kind of specialization with things, right? So you might think of Adam in the garden. He encounters things before he encounters people. And there seems to be in male psychology, starting at the infant level all the way through the entirety of the male psychological development, a kind of interest in things, not a greater aptitude, mind you, but a greater disposition alike towards working with things, which is why, of course, you see so many more males than females in things like engineering and architecture departments, than in the soft sciences. Part of healthy masculinity is an interest in things, and you might think of Adam as making a contribution to the world by ordering the things of the world. But Adam's kind of full flourishing as a man doesn't really come to life until he interacts with the person of the garden, right? Yeah. And I think there's really something deeply important there, that masculinity comes alive most fully when it enters the domain of people, and in the experience of most males, when it enters the domain of romance and of a family, then as it exists in a corporate environment or in an engineering firm or an architecture firm, what have you. Sure. And when men, after doing those beautiful things that they do in workplaces, come into the home and do what Adam did for Eve and affirm her, right? Adam says to Eve, "You, alas, are bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh," and in that way acknowledges her common humanity, affirms her in it, and by virtue of that affirmation gives her strength. When men do that kind of servant self-gift thing for their wives and for their daughters, wow, there's power there. So to all of the men listening to the podcast, one of the things that I often say when I give more popular talks is, are the people of your life more important than the things of your life? Yeah. And is your masculinity coming alive with the people of your life, or are you a distant dad and a distant lover, right? If you can be an intimate father and lover, that is the kind that is deeply involved and initiates within your domestic church, that, right, is where I think the real power of masculinity lies. I remember a lot of listeners might be familiar with, there's a popular Christian psychologist named Meg Meeker. And Dr. Meeker has a book called Strong Fathers, Strong Daughters. And one of the things that she talks about in that book is that in the ordinary psychological development of a young woman, there's kind of like a transition point in early adolescence where young ladies start to value the opinion of their father a little bit more than they value the opinion of their mother, where when they're younger, they're looking to their mom for everything. Obviously, when they come out of the womb, they just everyone starts that way. But then they start looking to their dad, especially as they kind of traverse the years of their adolescence. And Dr. Meeker just exhorts fathers to say, your words and specifically your ability to affirm your daughter, she doesn't say this, but in the same way that Adam affirmed Eve, has so much power, and a power that is uniquely yours as a male. And so if we don't harness that power as a culture, then we're not only kind of doing dads a disservice and doing males a disservice, we're doing women a disservice as well. And that, of course, falls directly in line with the synergy that we were talking about earlier, that if we squash down males in an attempt, push-pull, to lift up females, right, in the end, the strategy backfires, right? It's not a zero-sum game. If we can produce good, healthy, flourishing males, then we actually also produce good, healthy, flourishing daughters, wives, mothers, women in general.
Yeah. I like this image in the garden where I feel this kind of suspicion of Adam, hoeing the ground and things before Eve shows up, and it's going I guess I better go home and eat something, make some food or something. For who,
That's
if
right.
he's a guy, he's probably hanging out under trees, not eating or something. But when he has to actually tend the garden for his wife or a person, when you have to do things for a person,
Yes.
then those things take on a real different character, different significance. And that's where, as you say, the masculinity, laying down your life for what, a cause? No, laying down your life for another.
For a
That's what Christ
person.
talks about too. That person is the highest thing in the universe. Whatever. And therefore, doing things for the highest things, of course, are the things that actually enliven and bring you out. And that's what the male is supposed to do and bring out masculinity. I think that's right. That's like a beautiful image about the garden. The garden. It's as if that story. Whoever came up with that. That was a good one.
Yeah, that was,
like
might
that's
even
on
say that
level.
was
That's some real work.
That's on level with
I think it's gonna
parables,
catch
right?
on.
That's like that. That's like that prodigal son parable. I wonder if they knew each other, because that's a good one too.
Yeah, they're up to something.
Yeah. And it's to kind of take this one step further. We talk about the good that that healthy masculinity can do for femininity. One kind of chilling angle to take on this a little bit is that I think a lot of people, when they approach topics to be really specific here, when they think about masculinity and femininity, they think like that's kind of like a nice thing to have conversations about and to cultivate if you want to. But it's not really like the core important stuff, that people should devote causes to and money to and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But I think especially at our cultural moment today, we're just really going to continue to lose until we repaint a healthy image of masculinity. And here's why. So I'll say it this way. There's an old saying that goes that boys want to be boys, right? Everybody's heard this before. Boys want to be boys. And usually that's said as kind of an excuse to just sort of hand wave away, like some...
Kid sets the house on fire and you're like, boys want to
will
be boys,
Right. But underlying that deep, innate psychological drive is something else, and that's that I think boys want to be men, and usually when they're being boys, when they're doing the risky things, there's like some sort of like assuaging. This is what Walter Ong would say of self-consciousness, right? In order to kind of like demonstrate to the world at large that they are men.
Yeah.
Boys crave this in a way that girls don't. Like you hear young boys talking to one another, like, I'm going to take away your man card, like, are you man enough? Right.
Yeah,
and you don't hear girls say, like, are you woman enough? It's
true.
It's not a thing.
Yeah,
and so there's a way, and there's deep work again in evolutionary biology, evolutionary sociology, psychology that has been done in this, that shows that there's actually anthropological reasons why boys want this more, and that manifests itself in things like initiation rites across time and across place, perhaps more prevalent than any single like male behavior. There's latent in men across cultures globally a desire to prove oneself to be a man and to have like an image of what a man looks like in your culture and something of an initiation rite. We don't have those today.
I was going to say it needs to be done.
Right.
It's nothing happens naturally, and if you don't do it, then problems. So you have to.
Yeah. And in that sense, it's the case that young boys are actually kind of more dependent upon the culture that they grow up in, right? And they don't follow the steady biological trajectory that their feminine counterparts do, Okay, so boys need that. They need that image. They need that initiation. We know that that's the case. And if all that we are doing as a culture is saying that masculinity is bad without simultaneously sort of showing what a good version of masculinity looks like, then you just kind of produce more of the same kind of problematic man that you're trying to combat. It's like I oftentimes say that toxic masculinity is a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. That is, if you only kill toxic masculinity without upholding authentic masculinity, then you end up with a whole society of confused boys that don't know what it looks like to be a man. So there's not just an option, but a responsibility to uphold good, healthy, wholesome masculinity in the highest echelons of society, particularly our places of education in our churches, if we're going to flourish.
So obviously the cause of men is the cause today. So we need man. But one way is to give just money. When you see a man, just give him money. But that seems to be ineffective. Bad. Is there any way that is there a program or anything they could tap in? It would people
www.myforge.org.
There it is. Perfect.
That
is a good way to.
So sincerely, if people are interested in checking it out, what we're really obsessed with is forming great men. and not men who are kind of, subscribe to some reductive, simplistic version of masculinity, but one that's good and healthy and wholesome and 100% Catholic. And so, check it out, www.myforge.org, myforge.org.
Tremendous.
Thanks,
All right. Thanks so much for making the time, John. And for those of you listening or watching back at home, be sure to like and subscribe to Godsplaining and find your way over to myforge.org by following the links in the description and or show notes. In those same descriptions and or show notes, you'll find other links for merchandise, for upcoming events, and for opportunities to support the podcast on Patreon. All right. Know of our prayers for you. Please pray for us, and we'll look forward to chatting with you next time on Godsplaining.